one more minute and then we'll start. Thank you for joining us. As we're getting started, I'll just say my name is Todd Eisenstadt. I'm a professor of government at American University in the School of Public Affairs, and also a research director at the Center for Environmental Policy, which is sponsoring this event. And we're sponsoring it also along with the Environmental Science Department. And we have a speaker who will introduce the rest of the panel from the Department of Environmental Science. That is Professor Dalia Abbas, who is a natural resources scientist at American University's Environmental Science Department. She works in forest operations and management, natural resource economics, and carbon emissions. She's worked as a technical expert in monitoring and evaluation of logistics and wood supply and value chains. I should also just say, as I introduce her, that this is part of an ongoing series. The next version of this webinar will be on December 2nd at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that's because we will have speakers also from Brazil and Australia, as well as Dan Fiorino, who's the director of the Center for Environmental Policy. They will be speaking on populism, democracy, and climate, adaptation in politically sensitive environments. So I will leave the floor now to Dr. Abbas, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Todd, very much. It gives me great pleasure to moderate this session on climate change and communities, building back better in a small and hurricane damaged economy, with very unique representation on the Dominica's quest to become the world's first resilient nation. On the 18th of September 2017 at 9:35 p.m., Maria, a Category 5 hurricane with 160 miles per hour wind speed and higher gusts hit the southwest coast of Dominica. The hurricane impacted every aspect of the island. Many other devastations followed suit. The damages and losses cost billions, and it has become clear that climate change is indeed a reality and can impact every aspect of the economy. Recovery, as it is, mandates resilience. Among those efforts is Dominica's quest to become the world's first resilient nation through ambitious yet eminent plans and strategies. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Honorable Francine Barron as our first speaker. Honorable Barron is a former Attorney General and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Dominica. In August 2020, she has been given the challenging task and opportunity to serve as the Interim Chief Executive Officer of the Climate Resilience Executing Agency of Dominica. CREAD was set up to assist the government in the pursuit of its climate resilience vision. The role of Francine, as she puts it, is to climate-proof the Dominica. Honorable Barron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dalia. And thank you to the American University for putting this together and inviting me to participate in this session today. I'm going to share my screen right now. Yes. So in 5 years, between 2005 to 2010, over 700,000 people have lost their lives. Over 1.4 million have been injured, and approximately 23 million have been made homeless as a result of disasters. And because of the intensity and frequency of disasters in recent times, I am sure that when the assessment is done, we will see that the statistics are much worse than those I have just quoted. Tropical Storm Erica in 2015 and Hurricane Maria in 2017 caused the death of 95 persons in Dominica, and loss and damage equivalent to 90% and 226% of GDP respectively. We have had a record 30 named storms this year in our region. And as we speak, Central America is being battered by a monster storm for the second time in a few weeks. These more frequent and intense storms are not the only evidence of climate change we have seen. We have droughts, fires, coastal erosion, coral bleaching, among other things. So the devastation of Maria, as Dalia has indicated, led the government of Dominica to express a vision to build the world's first climate resilient country. We began the journey to build a climate resilient country in 2017 after Hurricane Maria. There was no blueprint for making a country resilient, so we had to chart our own course. I'm having a difficulty here with the sharing of the screen, but if we can have just a moment. Yes. Share screen. There we go. Sorry about that. Yes, so we had the challenge. How does one build a climate resilient country? We had to come up with a model, and we had to determine what constituted a climate resilient country. So we looked at an overarching approach to national development, which makes society and economy sustainable and protects our natural and built environment, and looks at inclusive growth and how we can climate proof the country as far as is possible so that the gains that we have made are not undone by climate change. We had to develop a strategy for the building of resilience. And this was done by development of a national resilience development strategy. This we did it in 2018. And it's a high-level policy approach of government to the development agenda and the achievement of the SDGs. So a strategy for the transformation of Dominica that integrated climate resilience, disaster risk management into our national growth and development planning strategy. We haven't developed the National Resilience Development Strategy. This was translated into a climate resilience and recovery plan the following year. And it is an action plan for the strategy that is based on 3 pillars, which are climate resilient systems, prudent disaster risk management, and effective disaster response and recovery. We knew that the recovery process and transition to a climate resilient country would not be an easy task, given our capacity constraints. So we created a statutory corporation to lead the process. The Climate Resilience Execution Agency, or CREAD, which I now work for, was created by an Act of Parliament in 2018. And among the key elements that the CREAD was tasked to do was to promote the swift and cost-effective recovery of Dominica from climate-related disasters, to ensure that Dominica would be more resilient to natural hazards and better able to respond to climate-related disasters, to assist the public and private sectors and civil society to be better equipped to manage and recover from climate-related disasters, and to support government ministries to enable them to implement climate-resilient policies and priority recovery projects. CREAD was instrumental in the development of our Climate Resilience Recovery Plan, our CRRP, which, among other things, sets out metrics and targets and outcomes for resilient Dominica. It looks at priority initiatives that are based on the degree of impact, and that is the contribution to the overall climate resilience of the country versus the cost of resilience, and also a monitoring framework to track progress and help ensure the plan is executed efficiently using available resources. The CRRP is based on 3 pillars: the climate resilience systems, which covers systems and processes having the capacity to adjust to and absorb the impacts of climate change. The second pillar would be prudent disaster risk management systems. This focuses on minimizing and managing the tasks and the risks associated with climate-related disasters. And the third pillar is effective disaster response and recovery. And this speaks to the post-disaster phase and reducing the pain and the period of recovery. So these three pillars are which are have been developed into result areas. Look at the question of building strong communities, robust economies, and well-planned and durable infrastructure. A climate resilient country requires a whole of country effort. It has to be done in a holistic way. So the CRRP takes into account the voices of Dominicans as it, sorry, as it drives the resiliency agenda, which includes a focus on gender, vulnerable groups, and consultations with key stakeholders. So a resilient Dominica will have a stronger overall socio-economic development trajectory. It will reduce impact from climatic and other environmental shocks and reduce the time to recover from climatic and other environmental shocks. Our CRRP is organized into 10 priority areas, which are guided by the overarching objectives, which are at the core of climate resilience. And that is the building of strong communities, as I said, a sustainable, robust economy, and well-planned and durable infrastructure. So strategic actions in different sectors have been identified with priority based on cost and impact of the strategies. So for strong communities, for example, we look at communities having the capacity to absorb stress and be able to bounce back. So you're looking at key elements like access to shelter, food, water, power, telecommunications, our disaster preparedness and response. The other result area would be a robust economy, which is looking at limiting our production losses and our ability to be able to reconstruct and recover quickly. So the elements are elements such as access to skills, access to finance, diversification, and risk transfer. And the other core climate resilience dimension would be the well-planned and durable infrastructure. So we're talking about infrastructure that's able to absorb shocks. And you look at your roads, your bridges, your utilities, your ports, your airports, homes, shelters, schools, being able to withstand extreme weather events and being able to be up and running in very short space of time. And then we take that into the hardwiring of resilience. So we're looking at enhanced collective consciousness of all Dominicans. So everybody is aware that they have a role to play in resilience building for the country, protected and sustainably leverage natural and other unique assets. So we want to ensure that we protect our natural assets and we use them to help build our resilience and strengthen institutional systems. We have committed ourselves to achieving 20 climate resilient targets by 2030. And those are premised on us being able to minimize losses from extreme weather events and the ability to recover and bounce forward quickly. Now we have an ambitious set of targets that we want to achieve by 2030, which includes our 90% of our housing built or retrofitted to resilient building codes, the resettlement of individuals living in physically vulnerable locations. We're looking at having a robust economy where our losses as a percentage of GDP contribution would not be more than 50%, where we have sustained and sustainable and inclusive growth of minimum of 5% achieved. We look at our durable infrastructure that we would have primary roads and bridges open within 3 days, that we would have communications restored within 3 months, and so on. We're looking at the 90% of our population able to identify the pillars of resilience, because part of what we need to do is to ensure that our population is on board with the idea of becoming resilient, and they know what is required to be resilient and for them to be individually resilient. And of course, protecting our natural assets. We're looking at our agricultural land being cultivated organically, 60% of it, increased healthy coral coverage, and becoming carbon neutral, which is an important thing for us, where we have committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2030. And that will be achieved through 100% domestic renewable energy production. And we're also looking at increasing our protected forest areas to 67% of Dominica's land mass. So, some of the initiatives that CREAD is undertaking include a community emergency readiness initiative in pursuit of targets 1, 2, and 4 from our 20 targets that speaks to making communities safe and self-reliant during a disaster event and in the ensuing period thereafter. So this initiative seeks to ensure that there are disaster management committees in each community. We undertake a physical vulnerability assessments of communities, develop a comprehensive community disaster management plan, and provide all the necessary infrastructure, supplies, equipment required for our community to be able to manage post-disaster for a period of 15 days in the event that this community is cut off for a period of time. We're also, one of the other initiatives that we are currently engaged in developing is a resilient Dominica physical plan. We must ensure that our physical infrastructure can withstand or recover quickly from a natural disaster. So the Resilient Dominica Physical Plan will be a comprehensive plan that addresses all infrastructure and the standards that we are required to achieve the resilience. So it has to be prepared so that a structured approach to creating a resilient country can be implemented. The plan will address the critical areas of utilities, ports, roads, bridges, drainage, housing, schools, health centers, shelters, coastal and rivers. It looks at all these aspects. And it will also emphasize asset maintenance and consider the life cycle cost of the investments. There will also need to be a legislative framework to institutionalize the Resilient Dominica Plan. And that has to be established, and special development areas be prepared for Roseau and Portsmouth, which are the main city centers. In the Resilient Dominica Physical Plan will also include a hydrological survey and flood landslide risk management plan. Dominica is very mountainous and has numerous rivers, streams, and waterways that make the island prone to land slippages and flooding. So the survey that will be done is a mandatory precursor to the preparation of a flood mitigation plan. During both Erica and Maria, flooding had a significant impact on our infrastructure. There was housing damage as a result of landslides and flooding, and significant economic loss. It is a fact that hydrological events, which often include flooding and landslides, frequently influence livelihoods and the continuity of basic services. So a hydrological survey will identify the main drivers of adverse hydrological events and threats both to our watersheds and water supplies, and threats posed by human and climatic activities. And it will provide a more informed, data-driven and evidence-based foundation for mitigating our risks, improving environmental, economic, and social protections, and critical information towards water resource management in general. The risk mitigation plan will also detail activities, actions, procedures, protocols, and policies to mitigate the frequency and impacts of flood and landslide events. We're also looking at an innovative approach to insurance, where we look at educating the public of the importance of insurance, strengthening our regulation, and facilitating a dialogue between insurance companies and credit unions on affordable home insurance, and also leveraging the new thinking in insurance, including the use of blockchain and other technologies to increase Dominicans' access to appropriate affordable products. We will also be looking at the establishment of a Blue Economy Investment Fund. And this is to leverage private sector investment and in the blue economy, and at the same time steer towards initiatives which are key to support overall climate resilience ambitions of the government of Dominica. I know that I'm running out of time, so I'll just go quickly. The journey to resilience that we have embarked on is no doubt an ambitious and costly one, but it is one that we remain focused and steadfast on. Since the storms of 2015, we have resettled 2 communities in resilient, purpose-built communities that has integrated all aspects of resilience, including hurricane and earthquake-proof buildings and protection for utilities underground. Government has built so far approximately 1,500 of a promised 5,000 climate resilient homes for the most vulnerable, and public expenditures to support housing construction has totaled 15% of GDP through 2017 to 2019. We have rehabilitated 7,000 homes in 5 years. We are also ensuring that national budgeting policies and performance measurements frameworks are informed by resilience targets. So in conclusion, our small island developing states in the Caribbean continue to be disproportionately affected by climate change, and we must take the steps that are necessary to build resilience and climate-proof our countries. So Dominica hopes to become a model of resilience that can be replicated in other states that face similar challenges like we face. And just to say to you, you may wonder why I have this last slide with pictures of whales. The sperm whales are also our constituents. They live in the waters of Dominica throughout the year. I invite you to come to Dominica to view them, but we must also take them into account when we think of resilience. Dominica is pursuing an audacious project with Common Earth and the Cloudburst Foundation to study and decode the communication of sperm whales in the hope that it will inspire a new generation to conserve and regenerate life above and below the surface of the sea. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks. This was very interesting and very informative, and the measures taken are really very impressive, and a lot of lessons to learn for many of the areas in the Caribbean and Dominica. Thank you so much, Honourable Baron. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Emily Wilkinson. Emily is a Senior Research Fellow in the Overseas Development Institute Global Risks and Resilience Programme. She leads research on risk and uncertainty in development and disaster recovery. Her current research focuses on disaster and climate risk management, state responsibility, anticipatory action, and effectiveness and accountability in public policy. Emily has worked with governments, non-government organizations, and scientific agencies in Latin America and the Caribbean, East Africa, South Asia, and the Pacific. Dr. Wilson, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dalia, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me share my screen. I'm going to situate Dominica's resilience agenda in history, in the literature on small island developing states and the constraints on development, and within the kind of international post-COVID recovery agenda. So I'll try and cover all of those things in the next 10 minutes or so. I can't seem to move on. So why resilience? Why are we talking about it now? As has just been described by Ambassador Barron, the Caribbean has faced a series of major impacts from climate extremes, but also economic and financial shocks, and now COVID, going back as far as records began. And there's increasing recognition of the need to rethink development, to adopt a new paradigm. I think academics and policy communities alike, even economists would accept that development models are not working well, that development is not linear, and the risk and uncertainty needs to be better understood and managed in development. And I think there are some important signs now that the international community is taking resilience seriously. There's lots of sustainable development goals that focus on the need to strengthen resilience. It's in the Paris Agreement and is the focus this year or next year on COP26 will be around adaptation and resilience, and there's a push from the UK alongside the race to net zero and net zero carbon emissions. There's a race to resilience as well, and a lot of discussions around green resilient recovery, which suggests that this is now really a key issue on the international agenda. Dominica's resilience imperative emerged after Hurricane Maria, as was just described, but we can go further back in history and to see that there have been frequent hurricane storms, flood events, landslides, and other shocks over time, which have severely set back development gains. Dominica is a small open economy, making it more exposed to a number of these shocks, and the high levels of debt, of course, mean that it's harder to address these shocks, but also there's less fiscal space in order to respond. And I want to draw your attention to a couple of structural factors as well that you may not be aware of, which I think are kind of really critical in understanding the importance of resilience here. 70% of the land base of Dominica is unsuitable for modern agriculture. That severely limits the extent to which kind of more productive agricultural technologies can be used. And 50% of the population approximately is located in high hazard areas, and we constructed a map to demonstrate how that has changed over time using historical records of population settlements in Dominica going back to 1493 when Columbus first set sight on Dominica, to demonstrate how this exposure to multiple hazards has increased over time. The macroeconomic impacts of climate shocks are particularly critical, and of course Hurricane Maria is one in a series of extreme events over the last 30-40 years to have had a really significant impact on the economy. But I want to go again back even further into history to demonstrate that there has been this sort of cycle of boom and bust in agricultural production, due in large part to the monocrop agricultural model applied in Dominica during the colonial period, and really demonstrating that there are kind of the multiple shocks of different varieties which can severely affect productivity and food security. So the Building Back Better on imperative and resilience agenda in Dominica come from a recognition of these vulnerabilities and the exposure to hazards and the severe impacts of these shocks. But I want to draw your attention to what's really, I think, innovative about it, and building on what you've just heard. This is a locally driven agenda. It's been produced by Dominica, by CREAD and the government of Dominica. This is not an agenda that's written by external consultants or by the World Bank, which I think is really important. It's tailored to the specific geographical and geophysical and socioeconomic context of this small island. So the measures and the metrics, which I will talk about in a second, are very much tailored to that context. It's focused on self-sufficiency. There are a lot of targets and initiatives that aim to make to help communities to be self-reliant and to cope with hurricanes and other shocks, and without the need for external assistance immediately, which I think is really critical given the topography of the island and the way in which communities can easily be cut off by landslides and flooding. There are transformative, really important transformative aspects of this agenda, including around agricultural systems, critical infrastructure, protecting and leveraging natural resources to boost the economy, but also protect the population from extreme weather events. And the resilience agenda really puts people at the center, which is absolutely critical. So how thinking about how to measure resilience and why it's so important, I wanted to just as a sort of side note to mention that there have been ongoing discussions in the academic community for quite some time about indicators, what to measure. Is resilience an end goal? Is it a process? Is it about the resilience of a system or a particular group? Should it be a subjective or an objective measure? What constitutes a kind of resilience quality or characteristic? So these discussions have been going on for quite some time, and academics certainly don't agree about these things. But there is now the time has come to draw a line in the sand, to take some decisions about measurement, particularly at the national level, because of the need to attract investment, because of the need to actually have projects financed, to have a global commitment around adaptation and resilience. And there are efforts to establish now a global goal on adaptation, which has a resilience component to it. And there's development by the EU of a sustainable finance taxonomy, which doesn't at the moment have enough about resilience in it. It is more focused on mitigation, but there's a real need now to establish some agreement around resilience measurement. And here I think Dominica has a lot to offer. You've seen this chart before, so I won't dwell on it, but just to say that the way that Dominica is thinking about resilience is very much in line with thinking and frameworks that have been used elsewhere in development humanitarian communities, with thinking about stronger overall socioeconomic development, but also a reduced impact and reduced time to recover. And this is from multiple shocks, not just climate change. These are aspects of resilience that will help Dominica to address lots of different external shocks and pressures. Here is an example of some of the metrics or some of the 2030 targets that you saw before, but I just wanted to use this to demonstrate how we're thinking about the contribution that these outcome level targets will make to resilience, and they can be thought about across these three characteristics. There are some targets that are very much more focused about long-term socioeconomic development, and others that are more focused on how different shocks, the impact of different shocks and the ability to recover from them. So there's amongst the 20 targets, there's consideration of all of these aspects of resilience. And for each of the targets, there are intermediate outcomes and output level indicators. So a thinking has gone into how Dominica is going to measure progress towards its overall resilience goal. And this is my last slide, really just to summarize that there are options coming on stream now, and a lot of discussion around scaling up climate finance, green recovery, and debt relief, and how debt relief can be used to stimulate and encourage investment in resilience and green recovery initiatives. and lots of other sort of financing instruments which will be available to countries that have a kind of clear agenda around resilience and that have identified the targets and what resilience means and how it's going to be implemented. I think Dominica has a really credible plan with a set of initiatives attached to it and quite an impressive level of transparency around what's going to happen over the next 10 years. And I think this provides an important demonstration effect for certainly other small island developing states of what can be set out and what targets should look like and how to measure progress. And in addition, I think this makes an important contribution to global resilience knowledge to what resilience building looks like in practice and how it can be achieved. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Emily. Thanks a lot. Excellent timing, and it's great. Thank you so much for enlightening us also about the indicators and actions that are on the ground and happening. This is very, very promising. Our next speaker is Dr. Stacy-Ann Robinson. Dr. Robinson is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Colby College in Waterville, Maine. She has expertise in the field of small islands, global climate change, multi-level governance, and environmental stewardship. She has over 10 years of experience in working in the government, non-profit, and private sectors, including representing the government of Jamaica in the Economic and Financial Committee to the United Nations General Assembly and the International Seabed Authority. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dalia. It's a pleasure to be here and just to share some perspectives on what I've titled my presentation to be, and that's vulnerability to extreme weather events in the Caribbean. So one of the things I'll start off by saying is that this talk is not very specific to Dominica. We had two very excellent presentations before me that really spoke to the nuances of Dominica. So I thought my contribution could speak a little bit more to the broader or the wider Caribbean region. So in the time that I've been allocated, I hope to cover four things. First, I want to give you a little bit of context around climate change and extreme events in small islands. Then I want to talk a little bit about vulnerability to extreme weather events in the Caribbean. I then want to focus on the 2017 North Atlantic hurricane season and to then segue into responding to disasters in the Caribbean. And I'm hoping to highlight a couple points that will segue nicely into a discussion. Now, you've heard many terms already, and I will add to the number of terms that you'll hear today. But one of the things that is really important for following my talk is just understanding just the diversity of terminologies that I will use. So I thought a good place to start would be to explain some of the things that I'll be talking about. So these definitions have been taken from the 5th Assessment Report annexed to Glossary to the IPCC report that was released in 2014, IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So already I've mentioned extreme weather event, and this is an event that is rare at a particular place and time of the year. I will probably mention risk, and by that I mean the potential for consequences where something of value is at stake. And risk really results from the interaction of vulnerability, exposure, and hazard. So what is vulnerability? Very broadly, it's that propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. In terms of exposure, this is where the presence of people, infrastructure, livelihoods, ecosystems in places and settings that could be adversely affected. And this is connected to sensitivity. And sensitivity refers to the degree to which a system or species is affected either adversely or beneficially by either climatic variability or climatic changes. Then I will probably talk about hazards, and that is a potential occurrence of a natural or human-induced physical event. It also refers to loss and damage, where it concerns property, infrastructure, livelihood, service provision, etc. And then I'll mention disaster. And this is where there have been severe alterations in the normal functioning of a community or society as the result of a hazard. Now, another term that I will use, and we've heard previously from the two speakers, is small island developing states, SIDS. Now, I consider this my area of expertise once it interacts with climate change adaptation. But one of the things that I want to say is that there's no agreement on which countries constitute SIDS, the number of SIDS. So broadly in my research, I look at 58 countries that are spread across 3 main geographic regions. One of them is the Caribbean, and in this you'll see with the blue dots. Then you have the Atlantic, Indian Ocean, Mediterranean, and South China Sea region, and this is denoted by the red dots. And you have the Pacific that is denoted by the green dots in this illustration. So in the Caribbean, there are 29 SIDS if you are considering 58 countries that might constitute this grouping of SIDS. It's important for me to clarify that SIDS are different from small islands. I should point out as well that SIDS tends to be a political classification that came about out of advocacy by these countries at the United Nations. But if we're talking about small islands specifically, that might be based on their size. These countries might not all be countries or states. Some persons consider them the real islands. So in the context of the Caribbean, this could include, for example, San Andres, which is one of the Colombian islands, but would exclude Guyana, which is considered one of the SIDS in the Caribbean. SIDS certainly different from small island states or nations, where this categorization could be based on size, their states. In some instances, it considers income, so could include countries such as Antigua and Barbuda or Dominica, or could exclude areas such as Puerto Rico. This is also different from small states, which can be based on size, their states, but not all of them are islands. So this could include countries such as Belize and Suriname, but could exclude Cuba, because Cuba is a pretty big small island. All right, so now I want to take us back to the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report, Chapter 29, that focuses exclusively on small islands. And here I want you to denote the difference between small island and SIDS. Now, when it comes to the interaction of climate change and coastal environments, coastal communities, and small islands, it's important for the IPCC, for example, to have a very high degree of confidence in terms of the detection of a climate impact, as well as a very high degree of confidence in the attribution of that impact to climate change. So when you take a closer look at this illustration, which I took from page 1627, number 2 is that factor that the IPCC has a very high degree of confidence in terms of detection and attribution. And if we're to look closely, number 2 is sea level rise consistent with global means. So this is one of the things that I'll always say in the context of small islands, not necessarily SIDS. Sea level rise is that most obvious climate impact. So you're thinking, but what about the other things, right? So look again at this chart and you'll notice that number 5 is that impact that the IPCC has high confidence in terms of detection and high confidence in terms of attribution. And number 5 is coral bleaching in small island marine environments. So you're thinking now that we're talking about hurricanes here. So where do hurricanes fit into this? I want to bring your attention to number 14 and number 17 on the diagram. So number 14 refers to general environmental degradation and loss of habitat, particularly in urban locations. And number 17 is casualties and damage during extreme events. So what we're seeing there is that the IPCC actually has very high confidence in the detection of casualties and damage associated with climate change. However, the attribution to climate change is the problem that exists. So what we can take from this is that there is evidence of casualties and damage during extreme events, but that the science is not at the place where we can exclusively attribute this change to climate change. So what does that mean? It means that there's actually increasing evidence that climate change is causing hurricanes to grow stronger and more destructive. So I want to be very clear here that this is actually a case for intensity, but not necessarily frequency. So we're seeing now where hurricanes are producing heavier rain, their storm surges are riding atop higher sea levels, and in many cases, they're lingering longer over land, causing increased flooding and infrastructure damage. But the 5 costliest US Earth system hazards have all been hurricanes. So we're not talking about earthquakes, we're not talking about volcanic eruptions, we're not talking about bushfires. The big ticket items are hurricanes. So these 5 costliest hazards have all occurred in the past 15 years. So here we have Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Hurricane Sandy in 2012, and Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria all in 2017. So the point I want to make here is that these systems all passed through the Caribbean before they went on to cause significant damage in the United States. So taking a closer look at the 2017 North Atlantic hurricane season, it's been the costliest on record to date. In terms of type of tropical system, we had 18 depressions, 17 storms, 10 total hurricanes, and 6 major hurricanes. We're talking about categories 3, 4, and 5. In terms of loss and damage, we had almost 3,500 fatalities and close to $300 billion in total damage. Now, the point I want to make here is that SIDS broadly, but specifically in the Caribbean, these countries are disproportionately vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, to the impacts of extreme weather events. Now, when I'm talking about disproportionately vulnerable, I'm looking at it in 3 ways. I'm talking about high exposure, and one of the ways we can think of high exposure is the density of coastal populations. For example, the percentage of the population living within X kilometers of the coast, or the percentage of the population living below X meters. Another way that I'm looking at it is high sensitivity. We're looking at heavy economic reliance on coastal systems, particularly tourism and fisheries. And I'm also considering low adaptive capacity. So here I'm thinking about things like narrow range of political institutions, colonial legacies, restrictions on access to finance, and the ability to invest in response and recovery. Now, there are 3 photos that I want to share with you. This photo is actually a section of Barbuda post-Hurricane Irma, still on the 2017 season. Now, about 82% of the population in Antigua and Barbuda lives within 5 kilometers of the coast. But this density of coastal populations is not unique just to Antigua. In countries such as the Bahamas, it's around 97%. In Dominica, in Grenada, it's probably somewhere around 80% as well. Now, this second photo is of a section of Tortola, which is in the BVI, British Virgin Islands, post-Hurricane Irma again. And sensitivity from my perspective is illustrated in the fact that this is a tourist area and about 80% of BVI's GDP comes from travel and tourism. But again, this is not unique to BVI, and we're seeing across the Caribbean where the share of total employment is around 14% when it concerns tourism, and the total share of GDP across the Caribbean is probably somewhere around 15%. Now here we have a section of Northern Cuba, and this in my mind illustrates low adaptive capacity, because here you're thinking about the average wages in Cuba being around $30 per month. GDP per capita in countries such as Haiti is around $750 US dollars a year. In Dominica, it's probably somewhere around 8,300 US dollars for the year. So considering the level of resources at households, how can these communities respond? Now I realize I'm running out of time, so I will skip just a brief discussion on the 2020 season, and I want to move just finally into how countries can respond to disasters in the Caribbean. Now, one of the important things is to understand the constraints or the barriers, and this list is not exhaustive. I think it's super important to think about the frequency of the events. In Dominica, for example, we saw them being impacted by Tropical Storm Erica in 2015, and then almost quickly again by Hurricane Irma in 2017. We see the same trend with countries such as the Bahamas that in 2017 also hit by Irma, and again in 2019 by Hurricane Dorian. An important consideration is also the availability of insurance. Some of the trends across the Caribbean are indicating that the tourism sector tends to be very well insured, but not the residential sector. In terms of limits, we're thinking about small size, right? The physical geography of these countries and the narrow range of their institutions. Another consideration is political status. Not all the countries in the Caribbean are independent. There are many dependent territories in the Caribbean. And then you have countries such as Puerto Rico that have a unique colonial-like relationship with a metropole, and in this case, the United States. But access to financing is a critical issue. One thing that I'll point out is that there are probably about 5 countries in the region that are classified as high income economies. So countries such as Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, St. Kitts and Nevis will all have trouble accessing concessional financing because of their economic classification. So lastly, I will say that there are opportunities, and this from my perspective rests in regional governance and coordination. The work of the 5 Cs that's located in Belize, and SEDIMA, which is in Barbados. And these regional organizations can access financing for the countries in the region that might have difficulty directly accessing these resources. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacey, very much. Thank you, everyone. This is a very, very informative and very exciting session to moderate, honestly. I mean, going from all the current efforts and resiliences in the Dominica to really the outlook and the understanding of the targets and what has already been achieved so far, and then understanding the resiliency on the islands and how more of the technical difficulties of reaching out with the message of whether or not it's accepted that it's climate change or not, and what are the efforts and what is the role of the small islands versus SIDS in this context. So I would like to open up the floor now for questions. I do have a few questions that I have written up, and we have a few members of the audiences from the Caribbean, which is very exciting. Is it okay if I read out the questions and you could let me know if you would like to answer it? One question is, how do you focus attention and reach out in the community to have policy changes targeting resiliency when other issues of employment and immigration receive a much higher attention?
Would you like us to respond? You're going to this
I
now?
think, Francine, it might be best. This probably is for you. It came right after your talk, so
Okay,
you
lovely.
could start. And
Okay. For us in Dominica, I think resilience has taken center stage. After 2015 and the damage caused to us by Tropical Storm Erica, we resolved then to build back better. And so, and then after Maria came 2 years afterwards, when we had significant devastation, then I think the Prime Minister led the way by his speech to the UN shortly after Maria, within 4 or 5 days of Maria, where he said that Dominica will become the first climate resilient country. So since then, our focus has been on building resilience. And resilience is not only about our physical infrastructure, it's resilience generally. So looking at a stronger economy, looking at issues of social resilience, environmental resilience. So when you look at the overarching idea of resilience, it encompasses all of the issues. So the question of employment is part of it, because you want your people to be resilient, you want your economy to be thriving. So I think when you, for us, it was pretty clear that we had to go on the path of building resilience, and the resilience looks at everything holistically. So even where we're facing a situation of COVID-19 now, for example, if you have an economy that is diversified and therefore more resilient, then you're better able to withstand a disaster like COVID, which is not climate related, but has significant impact on the economy. Thank you.
thank you very much, Francine. Indeed, it is all connected. And this kind of also feeds into the next question, which is moving citizens from climate vulnerable locations where they have long route and history can be challenging. How do you manage to get citizens on board?
Again, for us, I approach this from two ways. We had to relocate 2 communities that were damaged as a result of Tropical Storm Erica. For us, it was easier to get people to go along because the disaster was fresh in their minds. They saw their neighbors and family, their homes were basically washed away by the sea, and landslides and landslips took away whole houses and families. So it was very clear to them that this was not an area that they wanted to reside in any longer. So taking the Petit Savan community, for example, we had over 20 persons died in that area, in some instances, whole families. And because the communities are so tight knit, everybody knew everybody and is related. And so in some instances, people's homes still remained in the village, but the entire village was considered to be a disaster zone and no longer safe to live in. So even though you had challenges with people who still had mortgages on homes that still existed, but they could no longer live in that community, they understood that they needed to move. And so the transition was made easier by the government providing housing support to them until they were able to, government was able to rebuild, not to rebuild, but to build a new community for them. And because of the particular circumstances, the housing was given to them free of charge. So it was easier for them to make that decision. But we do have other areas in Dominica that are considered vulnerable and that people will have to be relocated. The experiences again of 2016 and 2015 and 2017 has shown them that where they live is very vulnerable. So it's a question of educating the community to let them understand that they are in a vulnerable area, and that and the potential of them either losing their lives or their property, and making available to them alternative sites at a reasonable price so that they are able to take the decision to move. Thank you.
Thank you, Francine, very much. And building on this question, there is a question that says, is there a way for Caribbean nations to coordinate resilience efforts, or is it necessarily a country-specific challenge?
I think that Dr. Robinson spoke to the fact that we are all facing similar challenges in the Caribbean. And all of us as a CARICOM community we've all resolved to become resilient countries. We're not all SIDS, as Dr. Robinson has pointed out, for Guyana. Guyana is a low-lying state, but has similar issues with flooding and storms. So we as a CARICOM community are engaged in resilience building measures. The challenge that we face is that the building resilience is a very expensive exercise. And because some of our countries are rated as high and middle income, the access to concessional and grant financing is not always available, and in some instances not available at all to some of our countries. So it is very challenging to come up with the money up front to put in the resilience building measures that are necessary. But we have reached the realization that we do not have a choice. We have to try to do it. Thanks.
Can I add something to that? Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah,
yes.
I wanted to mention another kind of cross-border issue which is coming up a lot and sort of prompting countries to think about the need to kind of develop adaptation plans, resilience plans that have a kind of a regional dimension to them, is the issue of food security. And I think I heard somebody say on a webinar last week that Dominica and Jamaica could together provide enough agricultural produce for the rest of the Caribbean if it was kind of well organized enough, and if the distribution and the production was organized in that way, hence like reducing the need to import many kind of foodstuff, particularly in an emergency, from outside the region. So I think there are definitely aspects of this issue which are fundamentally regional and require that level of kind of coordination and solidarity, and certainly in the kind of COVID response, that coordination and that solidarity has been impressive, I would say, compared with many other regions in the world, and exactly the kind of thing that we need when multilateralism fails. So I think there are definitely aspects of this which are really require that kind of regional support. So yeah, so I think it's definitely a very important dimension.
Thank you, Dr. Wilkinson. This is very, very pertinent. I do have two questions that are kind of building off some of the points that Dr. Wilkinson had mentioned earlier. There is a question specifically saying that it's encouraging to see intermediary outcomes against existing indicators. And what is the plan to share performance against targets with the population, with the Dominican population? I guess it's one of those, you know, the work has been done. How do you report it back to stakeholders?
Thank you. Yes, it's a very good question. The starting point really for this is to establish a baseline. So we're in the process of collecting data that will be able to give a picture of where Dominica is at the moment. And some of that information comes from understanding the impacts of Hurricane Maria and some of the kind of post-disaster needs assessment and damage assessments that were done. But there's definitely a few gaps to fill there. And when we have a clearer picture of the starting point, then that's a great moment to then set out publicly the goals and the targets and the outcomes that are expected along the way, and hopefully set up some kind of dashboard so that people can actually follow that, because it's a great way of also getting people engaged and on board with the resilience agenda.
Thank you so much. One more question, Dr. Wilkinson. Since it's, you mentioned that there's difficulty in measuring resilience and adaptation. What are the de facto measures being used to assess progress in Dominica, and where they have had to bracket this problem and move forward?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we probably passed a little bit quickly over some of the targets in the climate resilience and recovery plan, but there are 20 targets and they're focused across these different outcome areas. There are targets around strengthening the economy. There are targets around a more resilient infrastructure, stronger communities, and around the environment. And so they're sort of divided across those areas, and they're all equally important. So we want to see progress on all of those indicators. What I will say is that looking at the there's a working paper that's been produced around a global adaptation goal, and the discussion in there and the kind of indicators that they're proposing are very much output indicators. So they're things being done rather than what happens as a result of those things being done. So, which is why I'm very sort of keen to emphasize how advanced really Dominica's resilience plan is in setting out those outcomes, things that we want to see change on the ground by 2030. So I'm not seeing that across any of the sort of national adaptation plans that I've looked at, or as I said, this global adaptation target. So yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Many thanks. Many thanks. One question to Dr. Robinson. What is, I mean, since it's not really widely accepted that resilience efforts are attributed to climate change, do you find that this is impacting disaster prevention measures?
Sorry, can you read the first part of the question again?
Yeah, I guess in your presentation, you mentioned at some point that it's not widely accepted that resilience efforts are attributed to a changing climate, or even the disasters are attributed to a changing climate in the community, and that was a problem. Do you think this impacts the prevention measures or the disaster prevention measures or recovery measures?
Okay, so one of the things that I want to clarify is the information I presented from the IPCC report was from the first release in 2014, right? So a sixth assessment report is due to be released in 2021. And I assume that there will be like a shift in the body of knowledge in terms of how we're understanding detection and attribution. So that data was as current as the release in 2014. So one of the things that I think it's important to consider is how science is communicated. And I think this links into the question that we had gotten earlier about how do you communicate the need to relocate. So I think once there isn't that direct communication line from scientists to persons implementing on the ground, there will always be a disconnect. But in the case of the Caribbean, where there is evidence year after year of the impacts of these hurricanes, and like I said, in the fifth assessment report, there was strong evidence in terms of intensity. I think the 2020 season is actually showing us something new in terms of frequency. So I'm personally interested in understanding how the science has advanced in terms of connecting the frequency of hurricanes to climate change. That hasn't been made public yet, but the fact that we are now tied in some respects to the 2005 season is really a cause for concern.
Thank you, Stacey. I do have a couple of questions here. One is about plastic pollution in land and ocean, and can you say anything about that?
Sorry, in relation to what? Sorry.
Plastic pollution. It wasn't, I mean, is this an issue? To what extent, and is it impacting the islands?
Right. In terms of Jamaica or just broadly in the Caribbean?
Probably Caribbean.
I would say, yeah, well, this is not my research area per se, but definitely throughout the Caribbean, land-based sources of pollution is really a challenge, especially to local governments. So in Jamaica, for example, the Kingston Harbor, happens to be one of the most polluted harbors in the region. And that has a lot to do with the layout of Kingston and how that facilitates the transportation of plastic bottles and other debris into the harbor. But I would say that perhaps there is a hierarchy of environmental threats. And right now, based on what we're seeing, the region is very concerned about hurricanes and about the ability to recover from hurricanes, especially when countries such as Dominica and the Bahamas are, repeatedly impacted in such a very short space of time. But like I think one of the earlier questions is that there are so many development challenges in the region. It's hard to determine which one is most critical, but what I can say is that many of them are very much interrelated, and any climate change considerations are connected to development challenges, are connected to resilience, and connected to another buzz term, which is transformation. How do we change our societies in such a radical way that can make us resilient to climate threats and other threats?
Indeed, and this takes us back also to what Francine had mentioned, the importance of education and awareness raising, and and working on the indicators and criteria. One more question for Dr. Robinson, mentioning how you've mentioned how departments and PR have a different outlook on resiliency. Any advice for the islanders who are within departments, like my family in Guadeloupe, to gain footing on resiliency without taking on something like French politicians?
All right, so one of the things that I've gleaned from my research where it concerns resilience and transformation, especially those actors that are working on climate adaptation, whether in the region or for the region, is that there's no general or common understanding of what resilience is. So my takeaway from that is that resilience means different things to different people. So I would argue that it's very much context specific, and that might be one of the reasons why it's challenging to implement a Caribbean-wide resiliency program, because what I would say is that in Dominica, resilience is going to look different from resilience in Jamaica, in the Bahamas. So I would encourage persons to have a think about what resilience would mean for them as individuals, as households, as communities. Because as I said before, resilience in a Guadeloupe or Martinique is going to be different, but the political status overall can also be a driver of change and also a barrier to change. And that again is gonna, vary between the French departments or the British departments. So just underscoring that it's very context specific, and it's important for individuals and communities and other social groups to determine what resilience would mean for them and how that can be the basis of transformation.
Thank you, everyone. I believe we might have one more question for, if that's okay. Well, one is really about whether or not the cause of what's happening is related to economics, or the question is, majority are believing that going solar energy and wind energy are best solution to climate change, but I think differently. I think economic development is the cause of the climate change, because economic development brings more asphalt and concrete, which it brings the heat island effect or urban heat effect. And this phenomena makes unable to cool down at night from daytime heating from black surfaces. From this standpoint, economic development and saving environment are completely 180 degrees. Are we misled or misinformed by energy industry?
I mean, I have a go at responding to that. I mean, I don't think there are kind of opposing views. So the desire to increase production of renewable energy in the Caribbean is both one of reducing environmental impacts and contributing to the kind of climate change mitigation goals, but it's also one of resilience as well, and having locally produced, if you like, sources of energy is good when there's a crisis, and reduces reliance on imports, which is good for all of these economies, with the exception of Trinidad, perhaps. So I mean, I don't think it's a sort of, it's an either or, but one thing that we're seeing a lot more of, and hopefully will continue to expand, is nature-based solutions to strengthening resilience and reducing risks. And really, you know, that's an area that's growing very rapidly. There's a lot of innovation there, and thinking about how to use kind of natural barriers to storm surge in coastal areas and flooding, rather than, you know, building a concrete wall. So there are lots of initiatives like that, which I think, you know, small scale still, but there's real potential there. And I think a lot of this is happening in the Caribbean. There's a real kind of innovator in that space. Thanks.
Of course, many thanks for bringing this up. And really, the last question is really emphasizing more and more that, you know, if no action is taken immediately, you know, more catastrophes are to be expected. Thank you, everyone. Todd, I don't know if you would like to end the session. It's been a very informative and great session from everybody. Thank you very much to our speakers, Honourable Baron, Dr. Wilkinson and Dr. Robinson. And Todd, thank you very much for coordinating and managing this whole agenda. Thank you.
You're on mute.
Goodness, excuse me. I want to thank our speakers who came to us, I believe, from Russo, Dominica, from outside of London, Great Britain, from Waterville, Maine in the US, from Washington, DC in the US. And thank you for all of you to you for joining us. It was a very interesting discussion. And really, it seems that we need to pay more attention to bellwether cases like Dominica and other cases in the Caribbean, because they will be and have been some of the first tests of climate adaptation. And it's very important for us to understand how to take a holistic view of this and a broad approach. So we really do appreciate the experience of Dominica and other Caribbean islands, and we'll continue to follow those very closely. Thank you again. Please join us on December 2nd at 6 p.m. for the next in a series. We will have another talk in February, but on December 2nd, it will be Populism, Democracy, and Climate Adaptation in Politically Sensitive Environments. Again, just to thank our speakers and all of you for joining us. Thank you very much. Thank you.